It's an honor to be here. I'm grateful for the time dedicated for water, the issue of water.
You came bearing gifts. Thank you also for the book.
Yes, so this is co-authored by our founders, Gary White, who's an engineer, and Matt Damon, of course.
Whom we all know from his Hollywood films.
Yes.
Well, I'd like to get back to this in a little while, but for now, maybe we can talk about the cause, right? It's actually water and sanitation, but maybe you can give us the big picture. What is the issue that people should be concerned about? Because we don't really think about water that much, as we've been talking before the show.
Yes.
We don't miss it until there's an interruption, right? But we take it for granted. But what is the big picture?
So you may think it's only a brewing issue when it's already a crisis.
Right.
So you have around 780 million who don't have access globally to water, safe water.
Yeah.
And then you talk about probably another, every two minutes, a child dies of waterborne diseases. 200 million hours are spent by women and children, meaning being taken away from their productive hours to contribute to the society and fetching water instead. So in the Philippines, I mean, it is a reality. You have disruption of water. You go to the rural areas, everybody's still relying on water from the wells. You talk to the farmers. I mean, that's my reality right now when I established my home in Batangas. You talk to the farmers, it's the same universal story. They don't have a childhood to speak of. As early as 7 years old, they've been fetching water for hours every day. At 7 years old, they start to fetch water like at the whole vendor. At 7, they have one pail on one side of their shoulder. As they grow older, a second pail on their other side of the shoulder. It's really sad, I mean, to see how women and children and the poorer, lower income families are suffering. And I'm for sure, I mean, our reality here in metropolitan area, there are disruptions. So it's not just a brewing issue, it's actually a reality and a crisis.
Right, you know, it's something that I'm having difficulty to grasp, really, to be honest with you. I guess for people who live in gated communities like myself, you know, we think of water from the tap, right?
Yes.
And you know, when you describe the situation where people spend hours fetching water, you know, I normally associate that with people living in Africa and in South Asia, but you're saying this is also happening in the Philippines, even in your backyard in Batangas.
Yes, and beyond the Philippines. So most recently in May, around May, June, I traveled in one of the countries that we have operations in, had a conversation with the ministry, with a government minister, and I mean, you'll be moved because he really feels the passion and the need to address this issue. They have a lot of development institutions helping them, but then again, it's a fragmented approach wherein the real concern is beyond access, it's also the quality of water. So it's not just in the Philippines, it's a reality almost everywhere.
Right. Have you done any research on the actual time spent, maybe opportunity losses in getting water? You said, you know, people lose their childhoods.
Yes.
Just getting their daily rations of water for, I guess, for bathing, cooking, and just general washing, right?
So it's a UNICEF study. I mean, I've mentioned earlier, 200 million hours each day are spent by women and children alone just to fetch water.
Is this worldwide? Or?
Yes, worldwide. And there's usually in a household, what we realize, it's mostly the women and children that are delegated with this task.
Okay.
So imagine, I mean, as a woman, there's a woman inclusion angle too. As a woman, beyond just taking care of the household, you are also tasked to fetch water. And then especially for lower income families, I mean, it helps to have both the husband and the wife work to sustain the family, but because water is an issue for this lowest income households, they're not becoming the productive member of the society, helping the family financially.
Right. Most people, when they think about water sources in the rural areas, they think about pumps, right, in the backyards. I mean, I guess that's even true for many subdivisions here in Metro Manila and our other urban centers. But when you mentioned that the whole vendor grows up, with one pail, then two pails, where is this happening in the Philippines, or is it? I'm just ignorant. This is more common, I suppose, than what most people realize.
So, as you know, most recently we had a forum. So I thought that was my reality in Batangas.
Right.
I mean, we have a lot of people fetching water from the wells. And then there's one particular local government mayor who participated in the forum, first-class municipality. He was narrating to the audience, we are in crisis. Their source of water is drying up. They have water, but it's actually has salmonella, and the only resource they have possibly is a river, and that those facts were validated by consultants that did some due diligence. And
they did some testing on the water supply.
Yes, bottom line is, I mean, it's a first-class municipality. They don't have the financial resources.
Wow.
So it's really a challenge.
Would you say that this is an isolated case, or is more widespread than what most Filipinos realize in the Philippines?
I believe it's more widespread.
Okay.
Especially for water.org, I think we've seen several stakeholders, bigger entities approaching us seeking help. And I think that's a red flag already. If you see, if you view some big players in the water and sanitation ecosystem,
right.
if they're approaching you as an NGO, and it means that they can't do it alone.
Right. So,
right?
The other portion of the advocacy is sanitation. That's very much linked to clean water, right?
Yes.
But when you look at the leading causes of death in the Philippines, we've made some improvements, and we're actually quite, our causes of death are quite similar to first world, heart problems and diabetes and whatnot. How important is the sanitation part in the Philippines? I mean, is that still a cause of a number of deaths or illnesses? Again, maybe opportunity losses because they don't have access to clean water? So
the fact is, a significant number of people still practice open defecation in the Philippines. And with that, apart from being a source of sanitation or health issues, you think about the girls or women who have to do open defecation. It can be a risk to the safety of women and girls as well. So It's just beyond a health issue, Dante.
Well, I mean, it's not only the fact that we don't think about it. There's so many other dimensions to it.
Yes.
Poverty, as you said, gender equality,
yes,
and so many other issues. It's a paradox, isn't it? I mean, it's such an important resource, and yet it gets little attention from media, much less from policymakers. What you've been at this for not a long time, but what's your understanding that explains this paradox? Why is it getting so little attention despite the fact it's so important?
I believe it's not. So it depends on how financial.
Or are we not just paying attention to
it can easily be taken for granted because I think there's the perception that it's an endless resource. When it's not. Secondly, not to say that there's not much attention from the government level, because from the first, it sounds very promising from the first State of the Nation address of President Marcos. You heard about the focus on climate change, on water. Last week, which is also around the forum, President Marcos had his first speech at the United Nations General Assembly, and among the other things that was mentioned was climate change, and of course, inherent in talking about climate change is the water issue as well.
Right.
So I think it's more of like increasing the awareness among the financial institutions. Definitely, financial resources is important to address the water issue. There's so much focus on financial inclusion. I think there's not much appreciation or recognition that addressing the water issue is the intersection of addressing gender inclusion, financial inclusion, and poverty alleviation. I believe that there's a need for private sector to really have that full appreciation and recognition that if you solve the water issue, you're solving the financial inclusion issue, and you're solving poverty alleviation as well as gender inclusion. As you know, a lot of financial institutions and even the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas advocates for financial inclusion. It sounds like a very sexy thing, but they don't realize that even sexier is the issue of water if you're able to address it.
Right,
I'm sorry for using the term sexy.
No, but I'm still trying to wrap my head around, financial inclusion being connected to water. It's an interesting discussion that I think, have to devote a segment on later on. But before we take a break, could you talk about maybe the link between water and climate change? Because, we talk about rising sea levels and maybe seawater seeping into aquifers and water resources in urban areas. Is that something that's also within your scope of concern, or is it something more specialized that we should look at?
Yeah, so it's definitely within our scope of concern because it directly affects water.
Okay.
So you talk about climate change, with the greenhouse effect, droughts,
right.
The flooding. We have 20 major storms each year in the Philippines particularly, which affects the quality of water.
Okay.
And then you talk about climate change as it relates to several activities like volcanic activities. Every time volcanic activity happens, it affects adversely the quality of water.
Right.
For example, Batangas, Laguna, a good area, are affected every time that the Taal volcano gets active. So it's hard to disassociate one from the other.
And the interesting thing is, when I look at climate change, people, I think, have trouble associating it with gut issues. But really the most vulnerable people affected by climate change are the poor. And I suppose that's targeting also the people that water.org wants to help. Is that
Yes,
the correct reading of that?
Definitely. So we have, I'll elaborate later when you allow me on the business
Sure.
model of water.org.
Okay.
But it's a good point you've raised. So last week, as I mentioned, President Marcos was addressing the United Nations General Assembly. And one of the things that he mentioned was Philippines, to your point, that the lowest income segment are the poorest are affected. In the case of climate change, Philippines takes on more than it emits in terms of the carbon levels. So to your point, it's the most vulnerable that's really affected. It causes a lot of inequalities. It be climate change or the water issue.
All right. We may not be the country to blame, but certainly the poorest of the poor in the Philippines are the ones.
We absorb it.
Yeah,
right?
we suffer from
exactly,
it.
Exactly. So it's a good analogy. Again, it's hard to disassociate climate change and water. It's so interrelated, but it's the same. The point you've raised, it's the same thing. It affects the most vulnerable, the helpless ones.